Our panelists that are joining us for today's discussion are Abelardo Almazán-Vázquez, Sandra Sachar, and Simone Ponce. And I'm Sheena Jordan. I will be facilitating today's discussion. Although I don't intend to spend a bunch of time going into our specifics with our educational and professional backgrounds, just know that our combined years of world language teaching experience for the panel collectively as a group, it amounts to over 57 years total, which I would say is a pretty sound number to ensure that we are knowledgeable and we have ample experience engaging in these types of discussions. So without further ado, let's get started and dive right in. First and foremost, as we begin and open up today's discussion, it's of the utmost importance for us to open this discussion, having each panelist give a little bit of insight into their own identity, because this is something that's crucial when you're having discussions that are concerning social justice. The starting point should always be, how do we view ourselves, and being open and honest about who we are and how we're entering into these conversations. This is important because we all have implicit biases, and that bias is shaped by our values and beliefs, which directly relates to how we each identify. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start this conversation off with explaining a little bit about how I identify. As I said before, I'm Sheena Jordan. I am an African-American cisgender female. I'm also a non-native speaker of Spanish. I was born in Honolulu, Hawaii. The pronouns that I use are she, her, and hers. And that's just a little bit of background information about me and how I identify. So I'm going to hand it over to Abelardo, if you can share with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abelardo. I use pronouns he, him, él, ellos, and I identify myself as a Mexican immigrant. I was born in Mexico, and I teach Spanish as a second language.
Okay, let's hear from Sandra.
Hey, hello, everybody. My name is Sandra Sachar. I was born in Puerto Rico, and I am a native speaker of Spanish. I teach Spanish as a second language. I identify myself as Puerto Rican, Taína, and Basque. My family comes from a lot of different places. And I'm cisgender, and I use she, her, hers.
Thank you, Sandra. And Simone.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Simone Ponce. I was born in Caracas, Venezuela. I am an American citizen, and I am also a gay man. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am a native speaker of Spanish and an intermediate learner of Russian.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to just dive right in, and we're going to discuss a question. I'm going to post that in the chat here. Hopefully everyone can see the question. And today's question is basically for the panelists. They're going to have around about 5 minutes to just share their perspective and their own personal experience with teaching in the world language classroom to respond to the question. So our question today is going to be, in what ways can world language educators be more inclusive with the big 8 identifiers? And those big 8 identifiers are race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, religion, age, ability, and socioeconomic status. So in what ways can we ensure that our students are seeing windows, views into someone else's experience, and mirrors, reflections of their own experience in our lessons, in our classrooms? Let's start it off with Sandra.
Hello. I'm a big believer in project-based learning, and what I do, trying to integrate everything that we just talked about in my classes, is that I start looking at all the different lessons, and I try to put them in big projects where we talk a lot about current events. We talk a lot about what's going out there. And I do this together with my students. Like whenever I look at something and I try to turn it around, I ask for student feedback. I want my students from the beginning to be completely engaged with what we're doing and be part of what we're creating. Like every year, my first thing with my students, my first lesson is always about getting to know each other and setting community norms, all in the target language. But sometimes I call it Spanglish because sometimes we need a little bit of English in order to get ourselves to get to know each other and being able to establish that community that is then going to allow me to be able to bring in the world into the classroom, and for the kids to be able to look at themselves and look at others and be able to have all those conversations about what's happening in the world. Um, and it's an example of things that probably that I have done that bring this into my classroom is like there is a lesson that I do, and it is on immigration. And this lesson came because we're doing preterite and imperfect, and they need to learn about all this. But the way that I did it is that it's really immigration, what's going on. We're talking about all the different populations and all around the world, not just Spanish speaking, but all around the world. And also, what are the reasons why people decide to leave their countries? Are all the factors negative? There might be some that are positive, because I also think that it's important for them to see that not everything is negative, that people, not to see people in a negative light all the time. So there are a lot of different factors that cause that. And once that happens, what happens? What are the stories from people that are leaving one place to go to the other? What is that they encounter when they get to that place? And we start talking about also us. What are our own stories? Because we start talking, the kids and I, a lot of them, they have family that have come from different places. Some of them might not, but then they start telling all those stories. And this is a lot in the half and half in the target language, or at the end is more 3/4 in the target language. And they need to eventually come up with a story themselves. They start researching a country, what is happening in that country, why are people leaving, and they need to take sort of the persona of somebody and write a story. What is the story? What are they encountering? And this is just one of the things that I do with my students to try to bring the world in and have them see each other and other people and what's happening and create empathy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sandra. That's fantastic. I love the empathy component, because that's should always be at the heart of what we're doing in the classroom, helping them to come to a better understanding of walking in someone else's shoes.
Yeah, and also then trying to take some action after, because we also talk about, okay, this is happening, what they encounter, what are the laws. Right now we're actually talking about myth and facts on immigration, and what are the laws out there, and what is there anything we can do?
Absolutely.
What are the things that we can do so they feel empowered to be able to do things?
Wonderful. Abelardo?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when we're talking about these topics and indicators is the word vulnerability. What does it take for an educator to be where someone is these days? And the conversation that I had with colleagues is that it wasn't an overnight change. It was a long process of like learning, unlearning, and relearning. I feel important to mention that because as I was recently presenting for Minnesota Foreign Language Conference, I was making the distinction that in the past, in regards to immigration, for example, I used to be the teacher who shared pictures of immigrants crossing the border or hopping on the train, or like trying to cross walking on the desert.
Yes.
And my intent was there, but I have no idea back then about the impact. I used to remember how, like, yes, I want to talk about immigration, But in the process of curating material, it is important for me as an educator to constantly be aware of that intent versus impact, not knowing how, like the material that I'm showing may be triggering or may be hurtful. So like Sandra was mentioning before, I also do project-based learning. And the most recent project I did was with a local organization here in Vermont. It's called Justicia Migrante, where we were talking about the migrant workers, mostly from Mexico, doing the dairy industry job and asking for better wages. Like how do they get better working conditions under the slogan "Milk with Dignity"? So that was something that instead of just perpetuating the ideas and the notions about immigration, I said, yes, let's talk about this. Let's decompress those definitions of what does it mean to be an immigrant these days? What does it mean to be a refugee, an asylum seeker? Is it an ethnocentric view that it only happens in the United States? Is it happening also like from the African citizens from the west coast of Africa trying to go all the way to Morocco, to the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, and then hopping on a boat, on a patera, going to Spain, to Italy, to France? I think those are really powerful conversations. But again, as a teacher, I need to be mindful and careful on how am I selecting that material, because I need to remember to myself, to remind myself, intent versus impact. It's something that I should not underestimate as an educator.
Absolutely. And I want to speak just a moment to that point, and then I'm going to move to Simone. But the intent versus impact is very crucial, especially with regards to building bias and continuing to add to someone's preconceived notion that an immigrant only looks one particular way. So I think that is something that we need to keep in our forefront at all times, the intent versus the impact. That's huge with regards to our responsibility as educators. So thank you for sharing that, Abelardo. Simone.
Thank you. And I'm actually just going to piggyback on what Sandra and Abelardo just shared, the idea of empathy and the idea of vulnerability. And I come to this from both sides of the equation. I moved to the United States when I was 15 years old. And I encountered a school administration that wanted to put me in a second language. When I came in and when I was asking was, can I be in a Spanish language classroom and can I be in my regular English classroom? And that would fulfill my foreign language requirement, because sure, I am a native Spanish speaker, but in this particular instance, what I want is to be able to not have to think as hard when I am in that language classroom. So I think that one of the interesting pieces that happens in a classroom, in a language classroom, is that the duality of our human experience is very apparent, right? Because we all kind of switch our brains, we switch our personalities a little bit. I know that I am a different person speaking Spanish than when I am speaking English or speaking Russian. So we kind of tap into that identity of like who I present when I walk into the room is not the same person I see inside if I close my eyes, or the same person that I hear if I pay attention to what's happening inside and not on the outside. And the fact that we're able to tap into that in language learning, I think lets itself into being able to have these really vulnerable conversations with at the same time kind of having a little bit of a layer of protection, because we're all already in that vulnerable space. And you don't have your biased brain or your conditioned brain screaming at you like, Billy, boys don't cry, because you're not Billy. Maybe you're Alberto in Spanish class. So you don't have Alberto, boys don't cry. So you may have a different way to play with your masculinity or your femininity. You may be able to feel more empowered in terms of socioeconomic class because you are coming to it as an American citizen, which is very different than being somewhere else. So you're able to play with your identity in ways that you can't in other classrooms while still remaining true to yourself. which I think gives you the ability to go deeper into who you are. And that richness of language, like knowing new words on how to express your feelings or how to express how you see the world, I think is kind of the superpower of language educators. And the fact that it happens on the periphery of academics, it gives us that ability to kind of play with our curriculum and do whatever we want with it. So tapping into that, I think, is what I challenge all of us to continue doing when we walk into our classrooms.
I love that. I love the duality, because I definitely can relate to that, being that I am a non-native Spanish speaker. I feel like when I was in the classroom teaching Spanish for the 19 plus years that I taught Spanish, I felt like that was a really important part of sharing with my students of who I am, that I'm constantly learning in my knowledge of just Spanish language. And there have been times, many times throughout my career, where I've had students who are Spanish speakers and were able to have exchanges with me and tell me, well, I come from this particular place, and although the textbook may present it this particular word in this way, this is how my family and this is how we say it. So I think that in and of itself is just one example of the vulnerability that we need to be prepared to step into when we're getting into these discussions, because social justice is very much, like Abelardo was saying, it's about having that level of vulnerability and removing the fear of that. So thank you. And I keep monitoring the time because I want to make sure that we have more than enough time to get to questions. I'm going to ask, I think Fatima is assisting me with questions that are popping up in the Q&A section.
Yes, that's right. I'm here, Sheena. So far, we don't have any questions.
So we have, okay. I believe, let me see. I think there may be, so there are no questions. So I want to circle back around maybe to the panel in general, and ask you, what suggestions do you have if you're speaking to someone who's novice in this journey of how can they engage further, incorporating social justice in their world language classroom? What suggestions or what advice would you have for a teacher on this journey? Let's hear from Sandra.
For a new teacher, what suggestions I would have? Just think about when, like we talked about being vulnerable, we talked about being authentic. Think about that teaching the language is not just teaching grammar and vocabulary, it's also teaching the culture. It's heart and it's mind, what you're doing with your students, and just really incorporate culture into everything that you do. Authentic stories, short stories, articles, short videos. Start small with doing this, but make sure that they're authentic and your students are seeing that, especially learning Spanish and Latin or Hispanic culture, it is diverse. It's not just one thing. And that is something that is very important to for your students to see. And the whole thing that you said about their different words, their different ways of looking at things and saying things, depending on where you're from, because there's a lot of factors that influence that. So start that way.
I love that. Authenticity.
Reach out to other people. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. The authenticity is key. I definitely think that's important as well. And I would even add a little nugget in there saying move beyond the text, because a lot of times I think I'm thinking back to my first year. I was very, very dependent upon what was there in the curriculum or the text that was designed for teaching that Spanish 1 or whatever particular course. So definitely engage and move beyond just the basic text. Simone?
Yeah.
What suggestions would you have for someone who's novice? And when I say novice with regards to social justice education, it doesn't always have to be that they're a first-year language teacher, because what I'm finding on this journey is that sometimes those who have been at this for the longest, who've been in the classroom teaching that Spanish for 20 years, are the ones that have the hardest time moving into, transitioning into incorporating social justice. What would you suggest?
Yeah, so I'm going to tap into this idea of windows and mirrors. I think that it is something that we're using in social justice education now. But I also want us to think about the fact that always a window and a mirror give us a distorted image, and to play with that distortion a little bit and to challenge the assumptions that the students may have about us individually as a way to start the process of kind of creating a more inclusive classroom environment, is to bring ourselves vulnerabilities into the classroom, especially when they are very clearly a window or a mirror to our students, but we can show that distortion a little bit, right? So, for example, when I walked into my last job, I am from Venezuela. I have a little bit of an accent. When I come back from Miami, I'm tan. So there's all of these assumptions that I brought into the classroom. But then when I started speaking about my experiences and my background and the fact that my grandparents went to college and are lawyers, and all of these preconceptions about who I was were like, wait, you come from a different place that we thought you were. And it was, and again, it's just showing that distortion. You think you're seeing through a window into a life that is different than yours, but I'm reflecting yourself back to you very clearly, just with a different tinge, thanks to that melanin. So just reminding ourselves that it's glass and it distorts.
I love that. I love that analogy. Thank you. Abelardo, how about you? What suggestions or advice would you have for someone who's new to this introducing social justice education within the language classroom?
I believe that it is really important to find those educators who constantly challenge your notions and assumptions about what you're currently teaching. If we are in a place where it's like an echo chamber, like for example, I teach in a very liberal, progressive school here in Vermont, I'm lacking the conservative point of view here. So what I do is that I try to be out there and seeing how are people, educators, having a different point of view, mindset, that make me reflect more on what is it that I'm teaching these days. So then my biases also are being challenged, and being able to say, oops, ouch, and moving on, that's super important. Let me give an example of this. And this is part, circling back to the first question. Pronombres in Spanish, when we use they, them pronouns, I am challenging the notion that I can use ella and ellas as a pronoun for my students, for my non-binary students, even though RAE or whoever thinks about like the grammar as a colonized mindset thinks that I'm wrong. I had a lot of pushback for this, but this is an ongoing conversation. It's happening. Even the Real Academia Española put that expression in the Observatorio de Palabras. They removed it, but it means that we are having that dialogue, that argument with others about what it means to use inclusive pronouns, non-binary alternatives for our students, and giving them a chance to exist, and as an act of love, and not necessarily going with the conventions of the grammar language that it's proper, masculine, and feminine. But as a cis male educator, I feel it's important that I use my power and privilege to challenge those notions. And that comes again from looking for those educators who challenge to think differently outside of the box, to not conform to the standards that because you are not doing it like the Real Academia is doing it or their norms, that doesn't mean that we're not offering an opportunity for our students, especially our non-binary students that we have these days.
Absolutely. I like what you said with regards to using your power and privilege, because that's a very important stance for us to take as the adult in the room. We need to learn how to use our power and privilege to bring those things to light. And it's a huge part of what our responsibility is as an educator. I see we have a question coming through.
Yes, you want me to read the questions to you, Sheena?
Yes, please. Could you please, Fatima?
Yes, so we have a question that is asking about what kind of books or stories do you use in your classes that reflect cultural competence and social justice?
Okay, I'd like to pass that over to, let's see, let's go back to Simone. What books or reading resources would you suggest to use in the classroom?
Sure. I like to use resources that would kind of use the target language, but also explore cultures that were native to the Americas. So I used to read a lot of myths and legends about Native Americans in Spanish, because I think that it is also useful for them to see that language is just a tool. And that just because you are in Spanish class, that doesn't mean that you're only going to learn about Venezuela, or that you can use that language and learn about yourself as well. So use it as a way to expand their understanding of different cultures, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a culture that uses that target language. Recognizing that, again, what we're trying to show is that there are so many ways that world language education can bring social justice into the equation, and that can be one of them.
Thank you. I'm actually going to, because I see we have quite a few questions coming through. So thank you, Simone. I want to make sure that we're able to get to a few more of these questions.
Yeah.
Fatima?
Yes. So the next question is like, how will you challenge a language educator who has a long time in the classroom, but they may have good intent, but what is being imported is more harmful than helpful? Sheena speak to the need that was seen at some presentations last year.
Oh, okay. So with regards to basically a language educator, maybe that's been in the classroom for a very long time, and perhaps is having some difficulty with really recognizing the importance of putting emphasis on social justice education. Is that the stance of the question? It's coming from that frame?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. I'll open it up to the panel. Is there one who feels that they want to address that? Is there someone?
I can say a little bit. That's hard. That's a very hard position to be in. I'm going to be very honest about that. And maybe the way to look at it, it's not that you're going in with trying to change that person's mind to do things different, but to persevere and every time try to teach them something different. Try to take them into the path of seeing things differently by aligning with everybody else around you, especially if I'm going to be a little honest, and I have someone like that in my department right now that I'm dealing with, and it has been for several years. And you cannot put that person in the defensive. Is a really hard place to be at. And the only thing that you can do is like just to continue being very factual about, okay, this is where we're going. This is what we want to do. Bringing in things like, for example, comprehensible input, project-based learning, and sort of support them all the time in taking in small steps When they're saying some things that go against it, sort of like listening, validating, but shifting it around. It's like you're always being a little bit of a counselor,
Right.
and changing things around and having the support of everybody else around you to do that. But it's going to be a very long journey, and it might not you might never really change that person's way of doing things completely, but you will see little things happening here and there, and just sort of be glad about those small victories.
Right. I agree with that. And I think just always keeping in mind that it's a gradual process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, Sandra. Thank you for being honest. As I definitely understand that struggle very well. I think there was a question that also came through. Was there a question regarding jokes? I think.
Yes, there is a question is asking all of you for strategies about how to address the students making gay, queer jokes and comments.
Okay, Abelardo, since you spoke a little bit to your emphasis on exercising and using your power and privilege to address gender, how would you respond to that?
I also want to respond to the following question about ages and the pronouns.
Okay.
I'll make a connection, and I hope I'll do my best on this one.
Okay.
First and foremost, with those jokes, I have to confess, I'm going to be open and vulnerable with everyone. I used to be part of those making jokes. I grew up in a homophobic country like Mexico. I grew up in a society where my friends would think of me as a cool person if I crack jokes about LGBTQ communities. And I need to say that out loud, because it wasn't until I realized that what was wrong with that, everything that has to be challenged, including my family, my own family, normalizing those behaviors, then I cannot enter these conversations. So in order to say that about the jokes, I need to open myself up to the students like, hey, I used to do that and it's not right. And I invite, and I use the word invite you to not do it, and share stories about why this is a problem and why this is like harmful. But coming from a place of power and privilege, that will be my opening statement if I ever hear a student cracking jokes like that. Connecting that with the age pronouns, let me clarify a little bit more about what this is. This is recent. And I know some of the educators that I've talked to, they think that the X in Latinx, it's unnecessary. There is Latino, Latina, and using gender neutral pronouns in Spanish is not important because I'm destroying the language, or like the language should not be modified. But I think it is also a conversation about how language belongs to the people, not the institutions. People make the language alive, and there's not a such thing, in my opinion, as neutral language. Each one of us, depending where we come from, has a geolect, a dialect, a sociolect, an idiolect. So the fact that there are groups of non-binary people starting to use elle, E-L-L-E, as the alternative to el masculine, ella feminine, it's huge. But this is also coming from a place where it's not only in Spanish, this is happening in French. French teachers in some parts of the country, they're using IEL, I-E-L, as the gender neutral pronoun for some of the non-binary students that they have. And it's a work in progress right now, but it's having a lot of pushback, because I acknowledge how there are a lot of people in the United States, in Latin America, who believe that the X in Latinx, it's unnecessary, it's not important, and that we should be focusing on other issues and other topics. But like I mentioned before, if I don't signal by putting my pronouns in the Zoom profile that these are my pronouns, and you can be comfortable by expressing your identity, how are we educators making sure that our classrooms are safe spaces for students to be seen, honored, and validated? That will be my question.
Absolutely. Validation is key. And I'm so glad that you shared that and said that. And I just want to add on to that, because my current position, I'm director of diversity. And one of the things that I do, because jokes, as we know, they happen often in classrooms and the lunchrooms, just in general, everyday moving through any kind of space. I have a little strategy that I pulled from teaching tolerance, which is an excellent resource for those who aren't aware, but for those who are looking for more. Teaching tolerance teaches us that we can interrupt, question, educate, and amplify. So at the moment that you hear that joke and you know in your heart that it's something that is inappropriate, you interrupt, and then you question and you say, what exactly did you mean by that? Push them to have some ownership for what they've just said. And it may be that they don't even recognize where that bias is coming from until you question them. But interrupt, question, and then educate them with regards to why it is inappropriate, and let them know that that's hurtful. What they just said is hurtful. It's not going to be acceptable in this space. You will not allow it. And then most importantly, amplify. If you're not the one that interjected and stopped them from having that conversation, if it was another colleague or a student who interrupted and said, I find that offensive, then amplify what that person said and say, yes, I agree with you, so-and-so, that is offensive. We are not going to use that in this particular space. And with that, I just, I wanted to make sure we have time to wrap up, as I'm being very conscious and aware of the time. So I just wanted to, at this point, kind of close out the discussion and say thank you so much to all of the panelists. And I want to thank the attendees for their wonderful questions, and also thank GWATFL for embracing and understanding that how important it is to engage our world language educators in these essential discussions. And I want to leave you with this. I want you to reflect back to how we started the conference. And in the spirit of what Paul Sandrock shared with us regarding the can-do learning approach with our students, I encourage you to do the same for yourself with regards to incorporating social justice, and recognize, that teaching social justice in the world language classroom is something that we very much all can do. And we entered this conversation at various levels of comprehension with regards to social justice education, some novice, some intermediate, and some maybe even advanced proficiency. But we need to recognize that as teachers, we have to continue to exercise our 21st century skills. We need to collaborate, create, consistently engage in critical thinking and communicating to further our proficiency in incorporating social justice with our lessons. So walk away from this conversation understanding that this is a journey and it's not a final destination. And this work of social justice work, it's a continual process. It never reaches a point of full mastery. And we've got to continue to educate ourselves, continue to engage in these discussions, and learn to evolve as the world evolves around us. That's very crucial and very important.